When it comes to traditional composting, for right or for wrong, there's a lot of critiques and complaints about it. It's too much work. You got to get that carbon to nitrogen ratio right. It uses too much water. It smells. There's too many flies. And while traditional composting can work, a lot of people really do struggle with it, and they just simply can't get it to work for them. It's challenging for some people. So let's look at some alternative ways that we could compost in our backyard and get the same end results that you would get with traditional windrow composting. Great compost that you can use in your garden. Let's see a few ways we could do that. One of the ways that we could solve the windrow composting too much work problem is take out the work. Build the pile once and then just let it sit. That's what this pile is. This is a static pile, a cold compost pile. The whole idea here is I piled up my organic matter and I'm just gonna let it sit and break down over time, and eventually this will turn into compost. That's just how nature works. You can't even stop it from working. It will end up as compost. The critique about this would be, well, it takes too long. You're gonna have to wait a year, maybe longer for this to turn into compost. That's okay, that's the trade-off for doing work. You're trading time and nature doing the work for you doing the work. If we wanted to speed this up, we need to introduce oxygen to the pile. And we would do that by turning the pile. But for those of you who think that's too much work, that's where the problem arises. So if you don't like traditional windrow composting, make a pile and let it sit. The other great thing about these piles is you really don't have to worry about your brown to green ratio. Now, if you do put too many greens in here, it will smell for a period of time. You may attract flies for a period of time. It may go anaerobic for a period of time, but eventually it'll normalize. The worms, the bacteria will solve that anaerobic problem as all that mass underneath breaks down and the pile will eventually aerate. So if you can deal with those smells, those flies, the anaerobic conditions in the meantime, just layer up a bunch of stuff, it's organic matter, let it sit, and eventually you'll have compost. Whether using static piles or actively managed piles, one solution to the too much water problem, the leachate problem, the drain-off problem, is to build the piles directly on your beds. If you want water to get into your beds anyway, if you want the leachate from compost piles to go into your bed, if you want any of the runoff from the compost pile, which should be beneficial to get into your beds, and not into the groundwater or somebody else's yard, well, put it on your beds. If you want to make best use of your resources, build your compost piles directly on your bed so any water that goes through the compost pile and anything that comes out of the compost pile ends up eventually where you're growing vegetables. And suddenly all that water that you were wasting isn't really wasted anymore. Another great, easy way to do composting is do your composting in trash cans. It keeps things simple, it keeps things contained. You don't have to worry about a brown to green ratio. You don't have to worry about turning. For the most part, you don't have to worry about adding water to the pile or having water leach out of it. Trash can composting is pretty simple. I have a few videos on this on my channel, but in a nutshell, this is what we have. We have a trash can with holes drilled in the outside that lets air in to get to the outside layer of materials, and then in the very center, we have a piece of perforated drain pipe that allows air to get to the center of the pile. So at any given time, most of this pile is being aerated either from the top, the holes in the bottom, the holes in the side, or the center tube. Sometimes I'll lift these off the ground when I get them started to allow more drafting to come up through the bottom and through the center tube. But once they get working, I like to set these trash cans directly on the ground, because the great thing about having them in contact with the ground is the worms from the ground find their way into these trash cans, and you essentially get this big vermiculture bin that turns into really nice soil eventually. The downside of this is it takes time. The upside of this is it's super easy. You don't really have to worry about mixing browns and greens at any sort of ratio. You try and keep it balanced so it doesn't get too many flies or smells. But for the most part, pour it in, let nature do the work. It's really easy. One other constraint with the system is it's a little small. If you're doing big gardening, if you have a farm, well, it doesn't produce that much compost. You'd have to have a lot of trash cans to eventually get a whole bunch. So what if we could just scale this up? What if we could go bigger with this? Well, we can. Let's see how we can do that. If you want to go bigger with the trash can model, here's a way you can do it. The Johnson Sioux bioreactor. The Johnson Soup bioreactor is invented by David Johnson and his partner, and they came up with a system to solve a lot of the challenges and complaints around traditional turned windrow composting. He saw a lot of the same complaints that I've always seen. It's too much work, it wastes too much water, there's too many bugs, it smells, you don't get great compost, you have to get the materials all right. Well, this system solves all of those in one fell swoop. Or let's at least look at why it might or might not solve all those problems. The idea behind the bioreactor is you have a cylinder filled with organic matter. Now, if we just took that cylinder by itself and we just dumped a whole bunch of organic matter in here, and let's say these sides were solid, then what would happen? It would go stagnant, it would go anaerobic, because no air would get into the center of the pile or the bottom of the pile. So how could we solve that problem? Well, David solved that problem by adding landscape fabric to the outside, which is breathable. So anything on the outside, if this was just straight plastic, wouldn't get air to it. If we go back to my trash can model, I have holes in my trash can. Well, those holes are specific air injection points, but it's not anywhere giving you as much oxygen exposure as with this landscape fabric. So the outside of the pile for the full height stays aerated with the Johnson Soup bioreactor. Okay, that solves the outside of the pile problem, but what about on the inside? On the inside, he has something similar to what I use in my trash can model. He inserts these PVC tubes into the pile. There's actually 6 of them inside this pile, or at least there was originally. Because when you build the pile, you put these pipes down through the cylinder, you fill it with organic matter, you let it sit for a few days, then all the fungal hyphae kind of gelatinize the pile into a solid mass, and then you actually pull these tubes out. In the meantime, air holes stay right within the pile itself. So the pile itself is being actively through nature, passively in terms of your input. There's no electricity or fans involved here, but it's being aerated on the inside through 6 4-inch holes going from top to bottom. The goal here was to overcome some of the problems in static pile composting like I just showed you, and get some of the benefits that traditional composting has. The reason you flip a traditional compost pile is because you're trying to introduce air to the pile to prevent it from going anaerobic. Well, my static pile, the center of that pile is obviously not getting as much oxygen as the outside. So that's why it may go anaerobic. It may slow down in terms of biological activity, that requires oxygen in the center of that pile because it's not getting oxygen. Well, David solved that problem because there's no piece of this pile that's more than 12 inches away from ambient air. So an air exchange can always take place. In their research, they found that air could only penetrate up to 12 inches into a pile. So he designed this to make sure that no single part of the pile was more than 12 inches away from air, either being ventilated from the outside or from the inside. The great thing about this bioreactor is it's super low tech. There's not fans here. Now, you could inject fans into a pile like this. You could inject fans into a static pile or a traditional compost pile. And I may do that as an experiment at some point over the summer. But not everybody has those resources in other countries, and it can be challenging depending on where you're at. And eventually, we should look to more passive means. If you can do it passively instead of actively, well, sometimes maybe the passive route is the better route. This is totally passive, so you build it, and then you simply walk away. This pile will end up sitting here for about a year, depending on what materials you've put into it. And then at that time, you empty it out, you get all this compost that's super rich, super fungally dominant is one thing he claims about these piles. Now, I'm a little questionable about that. I actually want to talk to him about that because I'm not sure why this would be more fungally dominant than just the static pile that I build on my beds. But one of his claims is it's a more fungally dominant pile. He's also claiming that this is less work than traditional composting. It is. It takes about an hour to fill. I think a traditional pile would take about an hour to build, plus all the turning. So you are doing less work. over time. Now, the disadvantage of a pile like this is, well, you do have to build this thing once. It took about 6 hours to build this, but once you build it, you never have to build it again. It does cost some money to build this. If you build a few of them, you're probably building each one for around $50. But again, you can reuse that as many times as you want into the future. It's not a one and done $50 spend. So I love the idea of this system. He also says it doesn't smell, it doesn't attract flies. I don't find that my static piles smell or attract flies, so I think that's kind of a moot point. He also claims that this uses less water. I think one reason why you can tell this might use less water is when you water it from the top, and he suggests doing it daily via an irrigation system, you can tell if you're watering too much by just looking at the bottom. You'll see water actually coming through the bottom of a pallet. This is sitting on a pallet off the ground, so it's actually lifted up. So that water that's going through, if you see water running out through the bottom of the pile, you know you're adding too much water, you're wasting water. So the idea here is you water it just enough so you never see water coming out the bottom. That way you optimize your water use, and then you'll cover this pile to slow evaporation and help the composting process along. I haven't had these Johnson Su bioreactors for very long, but based on my first impressions, I really like the idea of them. Now maybe I'm just into composting. I have like 8 compost piles all around here. None of them are active, by the way. But I think this is a really cool, appropriate technology, because it does simplify things for most people. If you're somebody who is worried about composting in the past, or really fretted about some of the disadvantages or the hardships about, do I get my browns and greens right? How much do I have to turn it? It's not working. Well, then maybe look at the Johnson Su bioreactor. You can build this thing, fill it, and then just walk away and come back a year later and get your compost. Some other added benefits are, it's kind of cool looking in its own farmy, homesteady way. And who doesn't want to say they have their own bioreactor? I can just see the results at the office when you go in on Friday and you're like, oh, this weekend I'm going to build a bioreactor. And they're like, wow, well, what? What are you doing? So yeah, get some homestead street cred and build yourself a bioreactor. If you want to know how to build the bioreactor, stay tuned on this channel, because the very next video that airs will be a full build out of these 2 bioreactors. You'll get to see all the materials, all the steps, my thoughts in the process, little tips and tricks to help you do it along the way. Overall though, it's pretty easy. More updates on the Johnson Su bioreactor coming in the future. So keep composting, and as always, be nice, be thankful, and do the work. Some trucks driving by. My one neighbor's gonna be pissed about that, and kind of pissing me off because now I gotta reshoot that take.